Okay, so in this video we've now basted our fabric, so that's ready to start sewing and stitching into. But what I wanted to do is actually just spend a little bit of time talking about something which maybe seems quite daft to you, or maybe not. Feel free to skip past this video if you want to, but I'm going to talk about threading up needles, choosing the right kind of needle for the kind of thread that you've got. I'm going to talk about how you unravel and use sashiko threads when they come in this format. It's also the same for embroidery flossers when they come as in this format. I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm going to show you how to do a quilter's knot, which is a super useful little knot to have in your sewing arsenal. And then finally I'm going to show you about how we consider this as a reversible fabric, and so you don't want knots on the front unless you're doing knot work, but if we're just doing some sewn lines, we don't necessarily want the knot on the front of the fabric, and we don't even want it on the back of the fabric, because if this is to be a working quilt, then you don't necessarily want that. However, this might be something that's a panel for a wall, in which case you don't need to worry about it, but it's something I just do automatically. So what about our needle choices? Okay, so in your pack you've got a selection of needles. Some of them are wider, some of them are thinner, some of them, and they're also different lengths. The other thing that is different, why I've picked these needles out specifically for you, is because they have different sized eyelets. So I don't know if you can see that on there. Let me bring this right up. So they've got little different sized holes in the needles. Now, I'm assuming you're doing this with the pack in front of you, so you can check out to see what these all are, okay? Now, ideally, you want to go for the thinnest needle you can do for sewing, with an eye that will take your thread through the hole, okay? So what you don't want to do is you don't want to have the hole so small that A, you can't thread it up and it becomes really frustrating, but B, you don't want it to be kind of catching in there. And if the hole is just really, really big for the thread, then it probably also means that you've got a thicker needle than you actually need. So there's kind of like I've given you various different yarns and threads, and you'll probably have access to a number of different ones as well. So it's something worth playing around with, and you'll find that you have needles that you do and you don't like using. With regards to traditional quilting, a lot of traditional hand quilters actually work with quilting needles that are a lot shorter. They're actually usually about 1 inch in length, and this is if you're not working with sashiko thread, you're working with a normal, a fine thread. They will work with really small needles, so you can get really small stitches. I haven't included those in the pack because we're mainly focusing on big stitch, but also that can be kind of, it's a personal thing. I personally like to do my small stitch with the bigger needles or longer needles, so we'll play around with that, okay? So the first thing I want to talk about, or the next thing rather, is how do we open up? Let me zoom in a wee bit here, okay? Let's just move these things out of the way. So how do we get our thread out of here, okay? Now, they usually come with some paper around them, and often what you find people doing is they'll try to find the end and pull it out from there. What you actually want to do, okay, it always seems scary, is you take that off, okay, and when you open it out, you'll see you've got a loop of yarn there, okay? And so what you can do, okay, is you can then hold it out and you can then pull the thread off as you want it, okay? And then just store it carefully, like so. If you are buying a larger hank of sashiko thread, I will do a separate video to show you how you can work with that. But for these smaller ones, this is what we just need to do, okay? So then it will hopefully avoid us getting all of these knots that can often happen when it all gets tangled up. Okay, so that's how we get that. And you want to be kind of like ideally working with, say, like an arm's length of thread. You don't want it too long because you can start to damage your shoulder and your elbow from pulling the thread so far. It's better to have a slightly shorter thread and be able to keep sewing for many more years, in my opinion. Okay, so let's move these to the side, and what I want to do is I'm going to show you how we want to thread up our needle. So as I said, you pick a needle according to the thread that you think is the right size, okay? So I'm going to zoom in quite closely for this. You get to see my thumbs and fingers at quite close quarters. I apologise, they are working sewing and painting hands. Okay, so often what you see people doing is when they go to thread up their needle is they'll be kind of like balancing it all in the air, just trying to get the thread to go through the needle. And then what you'll see people do is they'll lick the end of the thread to help get it through. Now, it does actually help sometimes get the thread through the needle. However, what happens is when fibres or threads or fabric gets wet, it actually swells up, so it becomes bigger. So within probably about 30 seconds of me licking the end of this thread, I will have the thread will have swollen up, and that is one of the main reasons why people get knots in their when they're sewing, is because they're trying to pull through threads which are all different thicknesses. Okay, what you're actually better off doing is not licking it. Let's see if we can see this. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my thread and I'm pulling it down in between my thumb and forefinger. So I'll pull it back up. I'll just repeat that. So I'm pulling it through, down through my finger and thumb, till it's just about to disappear. So you can just see where the end of that thread is. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the whole of my needle, okay, and I'm going to push my needle over that, and there we go. I knew that would. I'm trying to do this at a distance. Okay, so I've pulled my thread back down again, okay, and then what I'm going to do is just push the needle over there. There we go, and that's threaded through there nicely. Okay, so I've got that now on my needle. Okay, when you're taking this off the spool and working with a finer yarn, okay, then what you want to do is the end which is still on the spool, okay, that's the end you're going to knot. The end that you pull off first is the end that you want to thread through the needle, and it's wound onto the spools in a particular twist direction, again to help avoid knotting. So that's a good trick. When you're working with the thicker threads, it's slightly different. Okay, now I've threaded up my needle, okay, with my sashiko thread. This is a fine sashiko thread that I'm using here today. What I want to do now is show you how to do a quilter's knot. Now often, and you don't have to do this, you can do the knot however you want to, but this is quite a really nice way of getting a neat and tidy knot, not one that's got lots of twists on it and loops on it, but also you get the knot in exactly the place that you want it to be. Okay, it's like a magic trick. So if you can see that all on the video, I've got my needle in my right hand, okay, and my thread tail in my left hand, okay. What I'm going to do is, with the thread tail and my needle, I'm holding it just like this, okay. I'm going to make a little cross. So you can see that there, okay. So let me just put it like that. There you go. So you can see the little cross, okay. I'm going to put my finger back there because I can't do it in midair, okay. So what I'm going to do is, once I've got where I want the cross to be, where that cross is going is exactly where the knot will be, okay. So if you're new to this, you can make it further, the cross further down, okay. If you are feeling like taking a risk or whatever, if you know what you're doing already, then you can keep your knot quite close to the end of the thread. And then what I'm going to do, I'm just holding those together, that cross between my thumb and finger here, and I've got the needle and the tails now in there. I'm now going to take the tail end and I'm going to go back around my needle and wrap it around the front of the needle, okay. Now, depending on how thick your yarn is, depends on how many wraps you want to do, okay. And this is something you're just going to learn about, depending on the thread you're using, how many wraps you're going to do. I think with a thread of this thickness, I'm going to do 2 wraps, okay. It might be a little bit big, the knot, okay. If I'm using a really fine thread, then I would probably do 4 or 5 wraps, okay. It's perfectly okay just to do 1 wrap if you find that 2 is just too many, okay. So I've wrapped that and I've just pulled the wrap, so it's pulled also down in between my finger and thumb. And then I'm going to take the needle, and while still holding this little collection of things down here, I'm going to pull my needle through, and sometimes it gets a little bit caught as I'm coming through the eye of the needle. I'm just going to wiggle it a little bit, and I'm going to keep hold of my threads, okay. I don't want to let go, and I just keep pulling this through here, and then when I get to there, ta-da, I've pulled it through and I've got the knot. There you go, exactly where I wanted it, okay. I think that might be an okay sized knot for what we're going to do, okay. Now if you want to, you can trim that off a little bit. I'm going to trim it off, so I've got 2-3 millimeter tail. I definitely don't want to trim it down to the knot, because if the knot comes undone, then we're not in a good place, okay. So that's how we do our knot. If you want to go over that again, pause it, rewind it as many times as you like, and rejoin us for the next part, okay. So for this next part, what I want to talk about is how we consider the front and the back and not having knots on the front of the fabric or on the back. What we want to have is our knots in the wadding, okay. Now if we were just going to be working around an edge here, we could technically just start just slightly off the fabric edge and then sew into it, but actually we might want to do some sewing which is just bang in the center, okay. So we don't want to start off the edge and thread our needle all the way through the middle to get to there. So how do we hide our knot into the center, okay. So this is a lovely little trick, okay. It feels a little bit brutal, okay, but bear with me on this, okay. So what we're going to do is, I've got some rather handy different coloured yellows on my fabric here. Now you don't have to do it by that, but just so that you can see what I'm saying here is, I want to start stitching at this point here, on this line here, okay. What I don't want to do is, I don't put my needle in there first. I actually want to put my needle in about maybe 1 centimetre, 1.5 centimetres further over, okay. So I'm actually going to go in just over here. Now what I'm not doing is, my needle is not going all the way through to the back, okay? My needle is just going in through the front fabric panel and into the wadding. And then what I'm doing, I don't know if you can pick it up on the camera, I'm just doing a little wobble, lifting up and dropping of my needle, so the needle is kind of weaving through the wadding, okay? But it's not going through the back. Still no needle there on the back, okay? So I've done my little wiggle going through, okay? And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come up exactly where I want my stitching to start. So the needle's coming through there now, okay? And I'm going to pull my needle through, okay, until I get my knot there. And this is where it's quite brutal. What I'm going to do, and this is where I might discover that I've made a knot that's just slightly too big, okay, we're actually going to pull on this thread here, okay. I've put my needle down in a way, I don't want to do this squeezing the needle in my hand. Put the needle to the side, you can see it there. It's definitely not in my hand, okay. I'm then going to kind of just hold my fabric down a wee bit, pull on this, and I'm just going to give it quite a tug. And you hear, I don't know if you could hear, if that picked up on the video, you can hear the knot pull through the face fabric, okay. It's now, sometimes if you're not slightly too small, it pulls all the way through and it comes straight out. If you're not too big, you just can't pull it through there, but you do have to actually pull quite a bit harder than you think. And because this is woven fabric, it does, you can just kind of like get rid of the hole that was there. So we can see there's no knot on the back, there's no knot on the front, it's actually secured within the wadding. Okay, and I am now ready to start sewing. So I now will go all the way through to the back and through to the front. I'm going to talk more about that in the next video. But just before we move on to the next video, there was one more thing I want to talk about, okay? And that is this other thread that I do tend to use, okay? So this isn't supplied, but if you're wanting to do really fine stitching, or this is the thread I personally use for binding, hand stitch binding the edges of my quilt, you can just use a normal thread, okay? You don't have to use this and you don't have to use this. This is what I use, and I just want to share my favourite kind of like tools and medium that I use. So this is, in particular, this is called the Bottom Line. It's Superior Threads, okay? It's really, really fine thread. There we go, it just picks it up as it catches the light there. It's super, super fine thread. And actually, some people will buy threads in all colours under the sun, which is absolutely fine. Personally, I prefer just to have one spool of this, and I use the same colour on, well, actually, I've used the same colour on every single one of my quilts, and they're all very different colours. Okay, so I don't know if that showed up. The Bottom Line Superior Threads. So I use this colour. This particular colour is 622, and actually it's so fine you basically just can't see it. And because it's in a grey, it pretty much goes with most things. The only reason I might use a different colour is if I was doing an all-white quilt, for example. And then I might use a white thread. But to be honest, the stitches are pretty invisible anyway. And then the other little thing that I have attached onto here is something called Thread Magic, and this is actually a thread conditioner that you can buy. There are other makes and brands out there. This is the one I particularly use. You can use, some people use beeswax. Personally, I find the beeswax a little bit claggy and there's a bit too much of a residue left on the thread, so I find it actually impinges on my sewing experience. So I personally like this one, okay? I've had this one for a long, long time, many years now. and basically what you do is, if I pull that out, I take my thread, okay, I place it into the thread conditioner, push it down in there, put the lid on, and then I basically keep them connected like that. So then I can just pull my thread through. So I've got my thread here, I've just pulled it through, and then when I'm ready I can just cut that off there. That's the end that's going to get knotted, the other end will get threaded through. And the conditioner, what it does is it makes it a lot smoother for stitching with. It also really reduces knots. I don't think, since I've been using, when I use this, I tend to only use it on finer threads. I haven't had a knot, so that's pretty cool. So that's a really nice additional bit of information, hopefully, for you there. Okay, so on the next video we're going to start with stitching, and towards the end of that video I'll show you how you finish stitching while embedding the knot into the centre.